This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. You know, that maze that we walk through every single day of our life, and some of us keep hitting that wall, and we don't know if we should go right or left. For a good portion of my life, that's exactly what would happen to me. I would start walking towards something I wanted to do, and there would be this big wall that came in front of me, and as I would hit it, too often I'd sit down on the ground and cry. Why me? I'm not like that anymore. And that's why so many of my guests on Avoid the Maze are people like Parker Harris, who also doesn't let the wall stop him. So Parker, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself so that we can understand. I almost think it's a little genius inside of you.
Yeah, well, thank you. My name's Parker. I'm an entrepreneur. Consider myself a lifelong learner. Really interested in philosophy and spirituality and business. And I run a e-learning platform based on masterminds for entrepreneurs and leaders across the world.
So for somebody who's sitting out there saying, I have no idea what he just said, can you tell me that in English?
Which part of it? All of it?
Well, okay. I'm an entrepreneur, but some of our listeners may not be, but they're going to gain some knowledge from the services that you have. So tell me the first reason why entrepreneurs, why is that your target audience?
Yeah, I guess to step back in terms of like a way people can understand is I heard this saying once, I don't remember who said it, but it was like small minds talk about other people, normal minds talk about events, and great minds talk about ideas. Um, and I'm someone that has been really interested in ideas for a long time. I just never really got a lot of joy or satisfaction from talking about people, and I think sometimes events even lack context. So I'm big on talking about ideas and learning about ideas. I've sought after wisdom as if it was gold for most of my life, and that has really served me. And then my business is essentially bringing together um, industrious people, people that really want to build things, create things, and add value to other people for roundtable conversations. So there's no hierarchy. It's not like a group coaching or a speaker event where there's a speaker like speaking at somebody, like most of school is structured.
Yep.
It's a roundtable conversation of peers to talk about the things that are most valuable to us so that we can maximize opportunities and break through bottlenecks and problems that are in different areas of our life.
It's too bad the school is not taught that way, because I think we'd have our youth coming out of schools really feeling that they got a real education. Just my personal opinion.
At least knowing about themselves and knowing how to think.
Well, I have to tell you that for so long, and I would say probably the first 50 years of my life, whenever I had an idea, I was so hesitant to claim it as mine, because who am I? You know, I'm just Karen. That was my mentality for the majority of my life. And it wasn't until I was doing some nonprofit work, and we were sitting around a table, and it all kept coming back to, well, this is the way we've done it, and this is the way they do it, and on and on. And I just finally said, excuse me. And I stood up and I said, that's great. That's maybe the way we've done it before, and somebody else does it that same way. But do we have to? And nobody knew what to say to me. And I said, personally, I don't think we have to. So I sat down nobody knew where the conversation was going. Even the person who was the chairperson of this group looked at me and said, okay, Karen, you better come up with some ideas. And I said, well, I do have a lot of them. And I started throwing them out, but I prefaced, they're not just my ideas, they're ideas that are floating around in the world. How about if we just look at them and see how they fit? If I had been taught in school that way, I could have gotten into an Ivy League college without trying, because I'm a lifelong learner, but reading a book doesn't do it for me. I have to experience it. I have to hear it. I have to touch it. And it sounds like that's where you're coming from.
Yeah, there's so much there, Karen. I think first off, I just want to acknowledge your courage in that moment to like speak up and think differently. I think that that was definitely a sign of leadership, and I think, leadership is potentially really valuable and often missing. And I think that, part of innovation is thinking differently about something and being able to risk that. And unfortunately, I back to context, right? For most of human history, the answer supposedly was like, a king or a queen or some sort of
Right.
elite person was supposed to have the answer. But I think even if we looked back on that, they usually had a giant set of advisors that they would get ideas from and bounce ideas off of. So, reading is such an interesting thing. I have received a lot of value from reading. I think one of the challenges is, and I'm going to put quotes around right here, but like reading the right book, right? Like reading the book that's actually authentically relevant to the person and where they're at. Because a lot of times, reading a book can just be a way of being distracted or escaping from the reality of what we're facing. One of the biggest changes in my life, and I'm thinking about this because of the name of this podcast, like specifically the maze part of it. I think one of the biggest powers that we have as individuals is like to assign meaning over a situation. Like what does a certain event mean, or what does it mean when someone said this or did this? And I'm a natural problem solver. I'm very comfortable there, and I think I get a lot of like acceptance or some sort of positive feedback of when I'm solving problems for other people. And I remember reading a book that had a big impact on my life, and the quote that really changed my paradigm was, "Life is not a problem to be solved, but an adventure to be lived." And I think when we make life mean that it's a problem, when we make it like a maze, right? Like a maze is almost kind of like a problem that we need to solve. For me, there's less joy and a less fun, less flow, less peace, because I'm just like almost looking for problems to solve versus embracing the adventure, embracing the journey. And I think that's one of those things that's like very cliche at this time to
Right.
like, hey, just enjoy the journey. And when I actually started to do that, everything changed. So a lot of wisdom, I think, can be really easy to regurgitate or to intellectually understand, but to like viscerally understand it in our body and throughout our cells and like live it is a much more challenging thing. And what I see in these mastermind groups or in these roundtable conversations is when one person teaches, two people learn. Right? Like almost
Interesting. Yes.
when we
Yeah.
teach something, we almost viscerally understand it and activate knowledge that we already have within us to live it and make it more wisdom than knowledge.
Well, it's interesting. When I named this podcast, I named it for a very specific purpose. And that was, we don't have to get stuck when we hit that wall. That wall is there for a reason. Okay. And the first 50 years of my life, I didn't understand what that reason was. And I didn't try to experiment because I was brought up in a manner that you're going to walk down this straight path. That's your life. Just keep going. Well, there is no straight path. Something is always going to be there. And when I started this, I wanted people to understand that the wall is not there to stop you. The wall is there to make you think, okay, this is a challenge. Do I climb over it? Do I, take 100 steps back and go running to try to jump over it? Do I try to knock it down? Or do I walk around it in some way? Because none of those answers are wrong. It's what works for you. And it's made me look at life so much differently. So for instance, I had to go get a COVID shot on Friday. It's my 5th one. I know what the COVID shot does to me. I'm sick for 48 hours. When that 48 hours hits, all of a sudden, everything works in my body. I'm okay. So I had to confront the fact that if I'm going to go get this COVID shot, how is it going to affect me and my family? And so there's conversation around it before we went, because my husband had all these wonderful plans for us this weekend. And the answer was, we can get around that. If I'm well enough, I'll go. If I'm not well enough, you go. And those are conversations that so many of us are so afraid of having. But it sounds like in your forum, they can be much easier, because we're all putting our heads together to come up with ideas, solutions, and get rid of the problems.
What you said about the maze really is interesting to me, because it's almost like we confront something, whether it's a wall or a dead end, and there's a lot of different choices that we can make from there. And part of it is the awareness of who we are. And then I think there's another part of it of growing, evolving, getting stronger, getting smarter, something to either climb over the wall or to break through the wall, and another cliche thing is it's as taking the journey. It's not, the gift is not the destination, it's who we become in the process of that journey. And the more I live this journey, that really is the gift, like someone that can handle any wall or any problem and either overcome it or lead other people to overcome it, communicate it. There's so much there. So that's really cool. I think what happens in these forums that I consider it like a platform versus an application, because
Okay.
we're not there to get somebody from point A to point B, or it's not like we're even trying to get a certain result that we prescribe to be the correct results. It's really a place that people can come and solve different problems over time, because as we solve one problem, another one usually appears.
Sure.
And I think one of the challenges with life, Mark Twain said it this way: it's like, it's not what you don't know that's going to hurt you, it's what you know that isn't so. And I see that a lot, where it's not what the person doesn't know that's the issue. It's what they think they know, that they've tried everything and it's still not working. And it's like, well, how many things have you really tried? Well, it's like, well, I did these 10 things. And it's like, okay, well, there's probably 100 more, 1,000 more. Let's try some of those. And one of the first things in design thinking or problem solving, or even in leadership, is like, well, what is the problem we're actually trying to solve here? A lot of times it's not very clear what problem we're actually solving.
Right.
And when even really smart, really successful people, they'll bring an issue to the table or an opportunity to the table, And the problem that they think they have is not actually the problem that they have. And so we have to like drill deeper to get to a root cause and make sure we're solving the right problem. And often what I see is when people know what the problem is, they already know how to solve it. They just didn't even know what the problem was. And one of the biggest problems that I've had to overcome in my life that I knew that, something that I knew that wasn't so, or that wasn't true, was, I thought that I was really into personal development, that like my mindset was strong, that I had a growth mindset. But in actuality, and it took another person to really challenge me on this, is I had a strong victim mentality. And that victim mentality came from the past, and things that happened to me, which I've now reframed to happen for me. But being bullied for most of my childhood, and different mistakes I made because of that, and the past, and regret and shame and wishing that things were different than they were, and all of that like accumulated into this mindset of being, I was a victim of my story versus the hero of my story. And when I would, and the context of this was a business issue that I was bringing to the table. And it was like the third time I brought this issue to the table, and someone was finally like, hey, I've heard this a lot of times, and I don't think this is a strategic issue or a tactics issue. I think that this is an identity issue, like a mindset issue around being a victim. And I was very defensive about it initially. And then over several days and several weeks, I was able to realize that that was true. And it unlocked a lot of growth and the next evolution of Parker that led to, so much freedom and abundance. I'm traveling the world with my wife right now, and just so many amazing things occurred once I moved out of that victim mentality. But I didn't even know that I had that victim mentality.
It's interesting that you're telling that part of your story, because my youngest son, his love has always been sports, and he got a job working with the Cleveland Guardians, worked for them for 5 years, and there really wasn't any place for him to go in his capacity. And they were very honest with him. We'd love to keep you, but right now, we don't see what the next level is for you. And so he decided, what, they were right. Hopefully someday he'll come back. He went out looking for another job. But one of the things he started to realize when he was being interviewed, he too had been bullied the majority of his young life, all the way through college, basically. And so he would go into interviews in the beginning. They're not going to like me. They're not going to hire me. What am I doing? And of course, he wouldn't listen to his dad or I, and that's fine. We're the old fogies. I get it. But he watched, and I don't even, something about history on Netflix. And all of a sudden this bell clicked. They don't know why I think I'm a victim. So why am I going in there being a victim? His next interview, they said, we're taking you on to the next interview. He came out of his room and he looks at me, he goes, oh my God, I don't have to be a victim anymore. And the growth we have seen in this past year, he moved 1,000 miles away from home. He now is not afraid to say something that maybe people won't agree with, because as he says to himself, am I going to say this to you and you don't like it? You may say something to me that I don't like, but it doesn't mean that you're the victim when I say it, or I'm the victim when you say it. I love the fact that he figured that out. But so many of us are living in a world where we are bullied all the time. So how do we help ourselves get out of that mold?
Or you perceive that we're being bullied.
Yeah.
Like I look back on when I was bullied, and I think that I caused it. you know, by being immature in a variety of ways. But also, I think that there's a toxic culture within schools too that sometimes teachers unfortunately foster, where the person that is the most curious and has the most questions and is the most passionate, that the nail that sticks out gets hammered type of thing. Um, so that's a really cool story. I'm really curious what your son watched on Netflix from that history perspective. So
I'm gonna have to find out and then I'll email it to you because
please.
um now that I've been coaching, I even said to him, I called him one day and I said, I have someone whose life sounds very much like yours. I said, so I need to give them something. And what I'm giving them right now is not enough. Because this person said to me that they're very visual and they love movies.
Yeah.
And I said, so I need to know this so that I could share it with them. It may work, it may not. And at first he was very skeptical. It was like he was holding it close to the vest. This helped me, and I'm not going to share it with anybody. And then he finally said, that's sort of silly. He said, because if somebody had something to share with me, I wish they had. I said, well, that's how life is. And now you know how to help other people. I do find that our culture just stifles us a lot. And so my question to you is, when you have a group of people who do come together, do you find there are still people in the group who are not comfortable being in a group, sharing their thoughts, their ideas?
The investment of time and money that a group like this, requires, the level of commitment, that it's almost like people, like it's self-policing, and that people will opt in or opt out
Yeah.
immediately, right? But I do think sometimes people don't really get it when they come in. And I think a big part of it is learning to, give value as well as receive value. Like a lot of times people think it's about them, and the people that get the most from this really share abundantly with everybody else. And there's this energy about them that's almost just like, oh my gosh, how do we help you? Because your energy is so vibrant. To the point almost yourself like wanting to protect or hold. I was that way for a long time, and I think sometimes I still can be. Um, I think different cultures have their pros and cons. I've this model that we use has been around. It was inspired by Benjamin Franklin in a group that he started in the 1720s. Um, After World War II, there was a lot of people that inherited businesses that were very young, and they didn't know what to do and they couldn't tell anybody else that. So they all gathered together to have conversations to figure things out. And it's created some really powerful and impactful organizations that exist where there's 25-30,000 members across the world. And they have gone into different cultures, Eastern cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, and it just doesn't work there because people are afraid to be vulnerable. People are afraid to be authentic. People are afraid to show up as they are because they might lose face, right? And so I think, there's there's a lot of cultures that I really like, but I'm not sure there's a perfect culture. And I think it's like what you said in that nonprofit space, where it's like, well, this is the way we've always done it, but that doesn't mean it's the right way, right? But like our opportunity is to push things forward or to make things better. And even within America, there's so many different cultures, right?
Right.
Like there's so much diversity of culture, and even regionally. And I think that some of that's even breaking down with the social transformation that happened after COVID, where a lot of people from cities moved to more rural areas and suburban areas. So, and then the internet's come, and there's its own pockets and its own culture. So I don't know. I'm one of those people that, and my mom sometimes loves this and a lot of times doesn't like it, where I say, the thing that needs to be said, even though maybe people don't want to hear it. I think that's part of being raised well, and then also just embracing my own sovereignty, my own independence at a fairly young age. I moved out when I was in high school. My last year of high school, I moved out on my own. And that was a very difficult journey that I think in part made me who I am today. So I think different people get it at different times, and once people really understand it, they usually will stay in this type of environment or in this type of group for their entire life. I have a lot of mentors that are older that have been in their mastermind for 30 years, 20, 30 years. So it's interesting. There's a new type of science, or a new up and coming science called epigenetics, which
Okay.
is within sociology. So actually a PhD sociologist explained it to me. I believe it's the way that she described it was it's a subset of molecular biology that explains the paradox of nature and nurture. So people were always like, is it genetic, or
Yeah.
was it our environment? And, my understanding is that this field of study actually was funded by really wealthy people who had a child or a spouse that was abusing alcohol or drugs, which alcohol is
Okay.
just a drug. So it's just abusing, some sort of substance. And they would send them to psychiatrists or coaches or, expert Tony Robbins, whatever, right? They
Yep.
would send them to these very expensive people. And, most of the time that they would continue to abuse or use, that substance. So nothing would happen. But then they would go to like one AA meeting or one NA meeting, and they would never use again, or they would never, abuse that substance again. And the question was like, what just happened there? Right? Like, how did,
Sure.
and so they went into this group environment where it was very peer to peer, and they were able to open up and be vulnerable because there was other people that were, that were dealing with the same challenges, the same issues. And something was said that wasn't just like an emotional thing where like it was like, oh, that hits me hard. It was actually an environment where their DNA was able to translate in a different way, and that addiction morphed, and they were able to heal in a way. So I think that we're just starting to figure this out. Like
Sure.
the first book on epigenetics that I could understand was written in the last 10 years. And I think technology is also going to be a really interesting aspect of this, because there's so much great content online now, different podcasts like this, and, TED Talks, and, some of the smartest people in the world are starting to record content for free
Right.
in either 10 minutes, 40 minutes, or 2 hours, like depending on how much someone wants to hear it. And there's a gentleman that I really respect named Salman Khan, who created the Khan Academy, which is a nonprofit organization that is seeking to really support the education of people across the world. And he's recorded so much great content, for example, around like algebra and like teaching someone algebra. And when they started bringing this content and these tools within the education system, like in the traditional public school, public high school education system, what it did is it reversed the education system to be, instead of the homework being at home and the lecture happening in school, people would watch the lecture at home, and then they would do the homework in the classroom. But instead of doing the homework individually, they did it with the other students, and they
Sure.
started teaching each other and asking questions to each other, and essentially creating an environment of peer-to-peer learning. And so I think that the more that technology is leveraged in the education system, it's going to create more peer-to-peer learning and more of these environments for people to teach and to learn, and to learn how to communicate, to build confidence, and and figure out, I think, who they are.
Well, it's interesting. Not this past summer, but this past summer, I took a positive intelligence course. And we have remained together, the whole group, plus the coach who put us through it. We've stayed together weekly. We get together on Zoom. And it has taught me self-confidence. It has taught me that here is a group of women, and none of us probably would have known each other or even attempted to know each other before this, because our lifestyles are all so different. And yet in this group, there is so much commonality. And, you know, the first time I spoke up and I said, I love coming to the group, but it makes me so anxious. I think of 20 reasons why I shouldn't log on Wednesday night. And then it takes me another 10 minutes once I'm logged on to find my voice. And it has changed since then. But I realized once I said it, somebody else came along and said, oh, I thought that I was the only one. Oh boy, let me tell you what I'm going through right now. And it was like, and they would tell their story. And there was so much that was parallel. And it's like, we are so much alike, but we only want to point out each other's differences. And in this group, we're finding the strength of our differences to bring us together. And I know it's hard to be vulnerable, but I spent the first 50 years of my life holding everything in because I didn't want to be different. I wanted to be, you know, like the perfect mother and the perfect wife and the perfect daughter, until I realized there was no perfect. And that's okay. So I'm assuming that you probably have people who are part of these groups that their first initial reaction, first time they go to sign on, is, do I really want to do this? I want to do it, but I'm scared. I'm anxious. And what am I going to get out of it? And is it another cult? Because I've had people say that to me over and over again. Oh, you go to Positive Intelligence once a week. You know, what are you guys drinking? And it's like, I have my trusty water. I don't know what anybody else has. So do you get that from people who look into this, or do they understand the concept before they even come to you?
Some do. You know, I think, you know, you might need to ask that question to me again, because I might not be answering it here. But what comes to mind to me when you say that is back to the education system, where the education system focuses on, you know, a test where the goal is to get 100%, right? And which is perfection in that environment, right? And entrepreneurship and sales is like this as well, where the best salesman in the world has a 30% success rate. Sports are like this as well, right? Where the Hall of Fame baseball players have a 300 batting average. So 3 out of 10, you know, at bats, they get a hit. And the same with sales, like a 30% conversion rate or close rate means that for every 10 people that they talk to, they get 3 sales. And entrepreneurship to me is a game that's kind of like sports and in being an artist and in sales, where, you know, the best entrepreneurs are wrong more than they're right. And so it's a game that's very humbling. Like it's because the lesson of entrepreneurship is constantly that it's not about me. It's not about like the entrepreneur. It's about the customer. It's about the employee. It's, you know, and that gets beat into an entrepreneur if they're really playing the game 100 times in the first 3 months or more, you know. And once that switch happens, they're much, you know, for me, when that switch happened, I became much more successful because I was able to think more accurately and realize nobody really cared about me. Nobody cares what I think. Nobody cares, like, you know, if I'm right or wrong. They only care about what's in it for them, and, you know, how I'm adding value to them, whether it's the customer or the employee. And so in that way, it's, one of my favorite books, the main moral of it is that the biggest enemy to evil is accurate thinking. And, I think entrepreneurs are forced to think accurately about things in a really interesting way. And part of that, even, Jeff Bezos, one of the best entrepreneurs of our time, he he was asked, like, what's the chances of Amazon succeeding in the early days? And he said, I give it a 30% chance. And he even says now, looking back, that he was generous about that it was probably closer to 10 or 20%. And so I think that takes a certain level of humility and accurate thinking and risk taking, right? And being vulnerable takes a risk. But once we start doing it, it almost becomes addictive or like, there's this feeling with it. And I was talking with my wife about this the last couple of days. She says, Parker, you're kind of polarizing in that you say things that no one would normally say in that situation. And when you say it, people can trust you because you said this thing, whether it's positive or negative, right? Like sometimes saying the negative thing, people are like, wow, that person's real. Like, I know where I stand with that person. Like, I know what I'm thinking. And, you know, with my mom, she appreciates it. My dad doesn't appreciate it as much. And so I don't know generationally, why that is. I think there's a culture thing there too that still exists probably in most of the world. And in America, we're fortunate to be able to, like, there's so much thought leadership around the power of vulnerability from people like Brene Brown. And, I think it's starting to show up in different ways. Another buzzword for it is authenticity. And I think part of the challenge or the paradox is it's like it's not in every situation. We don't always need to say what's on our mind. We don't always need to tell people. But and I think one of the hard parts, and this is biblical, is that you can tell a wise person, you can rebuke or challenge a wise person, and they'll love you for it. But if you rebuke or challenge a fool, they'll hate you for it. The same thing. You can say the same thing to two different people, and one person will love you and one person will hate you for it. And I think that's the true with entrepreneurs and leaders and high achievers is they're not often challenged because most people are just trying to fit in and say the thing that's comfortable. But when you can really create a space for people to feel comfortable being uncomfortable and to be challenged, that's what they want, like, because they've seen the benefit of it, and that helps them get over that wall.
Exactly. It's interesting because I started podcasting 10 years ago. Basically was kicked out of my corporate America job, came home and thought, woe is me, what am I going to do? And it was my son who looked at me and said, Mom, what have you always wanted to do? And I said, well,
What a great question.
I wanted to go into broadcasting. I had two things. I either wanted to be a social worker or be in broadcasting. And he looked at me and he goes, why aren't you podcasting? Talk about the things that are important. Not going to be important to everybody, but it's important to you. He said, that's broadcasting, Mom. And sharing those words is almost like a social worker.
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I said, oh, I can't do that. I'm not going to make any money at it. And he goes, what's more important right now? Healing yourself and doing what you've always wanted to do, or the dollar? Well, luckily I have a husband who is working. So it meant changing our lifestyle a little bit. But I realized that if I'm helping one person, I'm also helping myself. And so I don't look at podcasting coaching as, oh, I'm in for the dollar. Some people are. In fact, I get very frustrated when I open up Facebook and everyone's saying, if you're not making six figures, you're not very good at what you're doing. And it's like, I'm making what I'm making. But the most important thing is each day I get healthier. And I know I'm passing that along. And then I find individuals like you who give me this other perspective on how people can get healthier and use their brains to make themselves feel good. And I'm sure not everything that they hear in that discussion makes them feel good, because sometimes, why didn't I think of that? Or, oh, I tried that and it didn't work for me. But if you listen with an open mind, you might see around all those things. So how do people find you if they say, hey, I love what Patrick has to offer, and it's something that I want to consider either for my company, myself? How do I get involved?
Well, health is such an interesting topic. It's something I'm really passionate about as well: health, relationships, business, personal development. So I appreciate you sharing that with me. There's a documentary I really want to share with you, and your son, I think, might benefit from it as well. It's called Finding Joe. It's a free documentary on YouTube. It's about Joseph Campbell and like the hero's journey.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite documentaries. I'm really active on social media. So my name is Zachary Parker Harris, and that's my username on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. On Twitter, it's Zach Parker Harris, ZAC Parker Harris. So whatever, I would encourage whatever the social media platform that the person, the person listening to this uses. If they resonated with this, to find me on there, and I try to share at least one idea a week on each platform. And then our business is called Junto Global, or Junto Global, JUNTO Global, and our website is junto.global.
And all that's going to be in the show notes. So nobody has an excuse saying we didn't tell them how to find you. I always have to preface that, because I'll have people contacting me and saying, it's not in the show notes. And then I make a copy of the show notes. Oh, there it is. It's right there.
That's one of the things that I like. I think people, the experience that we've talked about. Another kind of thought leader in this space said it this way that really resonated with me was, a mastermind is relevant to someone when their problems are no longer Googleable, and I think a lot of people's problems are Googleable, and the person that's right for this environment knows how to solve their own problems, whether it's finding the show notes, or like figuring out how to connect with this person, or building out a budget, or figuring, like there's so many things, there's so much amazing information on the internet now. Even, different social media platforms, following the right people, we can figure out ways to get healthier, ways to communicate better, ways to be a better entrepreneur or better leader, how to shift out of that victim mindset and into a hero's mindset, which is what that documentary is about, that I think you'd really like. So, I guess that would be one thing that I'd really challenge your audience on, is like really become the person that can solve your own problems. A lot of times it's so much easier to try to solve someone else's problem.
Yeah.
And be like, oh, like this is easy. And it's like, well, it's interesting when that person sees you solving your own problem, and then eventually they may ask, like, oh, I'm having this problem, how would you solve it? And then they're very open to receiving that value. But I think a lot of people feel more comfortable solving other people's problems than their own problems.
It's funny, because when my son was still living here in Ohio with us, he would ask us things, but then when we'd give him an answer, he did not like it. It was like, forget it, Mama. That's not the answer I wanted. Once he moved 1,000 miles away, the questions are totally different. It's not necessarily, how long do I have to let something thaw before I make it for dinner? Those things now he's figuring out on his own. But when there is something and he'll ask the question, he'll always say, I may not take your advice, but, and then he'll ask the question. And it's so much easier for me now because I don't have to tell him what to do. I'm not seeing things going on here, but he's given me the opportunity to share my thoughts, but also knowing that once he hears them, they may not align with him. And it's okay. He'll have to go Google his answer somewhere else or find another mother to give him the answers.
Well, necessity is the mother of learning, right? And I think
Right.
probably being 1,000 miles away is a very humbling experience
Yes.
in a variety of ways, right? Where, I'm 2,500 miles away from my parents right now. And, I'm realizing how grateful and lucky I am to have two parents that love me. And so I bet your son, feels very similar, right? Where it's like 1,000 miles away and maybe nobody loves him in the way that he's loved by you
Right.
two. And it's a very powerful thing. And it doesn't mean that someone's always right. Like we talked about, right? The smartest people in the world are right somewhere between 30 and 70% of the time. And I think the last part of it is, maybe he won't listen to me yet. Right. So
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. And hopefully our listeners will connect with you, follow you, gain some more insight. And I know I'm going to do some more following myself. So thank you very much. Have a great day, Parker.
thank you, Karen.
Bye-bye.